Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take complex, often dense research and, well, pull out the indispensable knowledge you need. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a figure most people think they know, Karl Marx. But we aren't talking just about the labor theory of value or, the structure of capital.
No, definitely not just that. Because our mission today is to conduct a deep dive into the surprising foundation of ecological thought. We are tracing the origins of rigorous environmental analysis, not really to the modern environmental movement, the 1960s stuff, but directly back to the philosophical and scientific foundations laid by Marx in the 19th century.
Right, and the sources we've gathered for this are really exceptional. It's highly synthesized academic research connecting Marx's intellectual lineage all the way from ancient Greek philosophy.
Yeah, through 19th century German idealism and materialism, and crucially deep into British natural science. We're talking thinkers like Justus von Liebig and Charles Darwin.
Exactly. We are going to reveal a Marx that developed a profoundly and systematically ecological worldview, one rooted in material conditions.
Yeah, and the common perception is just.
Yeah.
It's all factory floor and economic abstractions, right? But the radical insight here, the thing we're exploring, is that his entire critique of capitalism was fundamentally linked to nature, to the physical world. He established concepts that are absolutely critical to environmental sociology and, honestly, modern sustainability studies today, most notably the metabolic rift.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We need to follow the flow of his thought, starting right at the beginning with the bedrock principle that defines everything else he wrote. Materialism. So when most people hear materialism today, they probably think consumerism, maybe greed. But in philosophy, it signifies this huge ideological split. Can you maybe define this philosophical divide for us between idealism and materialism and why it's so foundational for Marx's ecological thinking?
Yeah, it's crucial to separate that everyday use from the philosophical concept. Idealism, most famously associated with Hegel in Marx's time, asserts the primacy of spirit or Thoughtgeist over matter. It basically assumes a world created by or unfolding from consciousness. The world is ultimately a manifestation of mind, and matter is, well, it's secondary.
And rational materialism just completely flips that on its head.
It does, exactly. Materialism argues nature is primary. It exists independently of and prior to thought. I mean, mountains and oceans were here long before human consciousness evolved to perceive them, right?
Yeah.
Marx's rational philosophical materialism is pretty complex. It's usually broken down into three interdependent parts, and each one is vital for his later critique.
Okay, let's break those down because they definitely go far beyond just simple physics.
Okay, first up, ontological materialism. This is the idea, the statement really, that social being, our customs, laws, economy, all that, is unilaterally dependent upon biological and physical being. We are organisms. We depend on physical laws. You just can't have a society without a functioning physical world to support it. It sounds obvious, but it's fundamental.
Makes sense.
Second, there's epistemological materialism. This asserts that the objects of scientific thought exist independently, sometimes called critical realism. So, the physical world is real, external, objective. Our knowledge of it has to be based on rigorous empirical science, not, religious dogma or just metaphysical speculation.
So if the world is real and independent of how we see it, that means science becomes the tool to reveal its objective laws, which explains why Marx was so focused on figures like Liebig and Darwin later on.
Precisely. It grounds his entire political economy in, reality, in the material world. But the third part, this is where Marx really transforms this ancient philosophical tradition into something revolutionary. This is practical materialism or praxis.
Praxis.
Yeah. The shift here is from merely observing or interpreting the world, which is what previous materialists have mostly done, to actively changing it through human activity, through revolutionizing practice. Marx never drops the ontological commitment to the real world, but he embeds this realism within a dialectical, historical, and relational approach to social change. It's about action.
Okay, and this is where the intellectual journey gets really interesting, because Marx, writing about modern capitalism, actually reached back like 2 millennia for his intellectual roots. His doctoral thesis was on the difference between two ancient Greek atomists, Democritus and Epicurus. Why was Epicurean materialism so important to him?
Epicurus was absolutely crucial because he provided the most robust, systematic basis for material existence, explained purely by the movement of atoms in a void, totally detached from divine intervention. He argued that everything, including the soul, the mind, were just composites of matter. Their existence was explained entirely by the size, shape, weight, and motion of these tiny constituent atoms. Pretty revolutionary stuff for antiquity.
And it's wild how those ancient Epicurean principles seem to prefigure modern ecology.
They absolutely did. Think about Barry Commoner's famous informal laws of ecology from the 20th century. Epicurean physics basically had two of them already. The idea that everything is connected to everything else, right? And the conservation principle, nothing comes from nothing, or as we'd say, everything must go somewhere. Epicurus essentially saw life as an emergent consequence of how matter organizes itself according to physical laws.
What I find really powerful and maybe often overlooked is Epicurus' stance against teleology, this idea of purpose or design in nature. How did his concept of the atomic swerve help him reject that divine determinism?
That's a fantastic point. It was a direct challenge to the whole scholastic and Aristotelian worldview, which was deeply teleological, the idea that the universe and nature within it operates towards some predetermined, divinely planned end. Epicurus introduced this concept of the swerve or declination, the parenklesis. It was a spontaneous, tiny deviation in the movement of atoms as they fell through the void.
Like a little microscopic bit of randomness or contingency.
Exactly, a contingency. This tiny swerve was critical because it just blew up mechanical determinism. If all atoms just followed straight, predictable paths, the world would be locked, a fatalistic machine. The swerve provided a material explanation for freedom and contingency in the world. It countered the idea that humans were just puppets following some divine script, and Marx saw this, seized on it, as the intellectual precursor to human agency, to the freedom needed for social change.
And understanding this lineage helps us correct a pretty major historical misconception, right? About figures like Francis Bacon. He often gets blamed for setting Western science on this path of like rapacious environmental conquest.
Oh, that is such a critical correction. Bacon, the guy associated with the rise of modern empirical science, was deeply influenced by Epicurus and Democritus. He praised them specifically for removing God and mind from the structure of things. He argued the first step to real knowledge was attacking reasoning based on final causes, on teleology. Bacon's emphasis was on material investigation. That was a necessary prerequisite to challenging the established order, which just saw nature as a subservient divine design. His goal was to understand nature, not just dominate it blindly.
Okay, so we move from the complex realism of Epicurus forward to the 19th century. Marx's generation had to grapple with Hegel's idealism, which was kind of suffocating. And the first major break came through Ludwig Feuerbach.
Feuerbach was absolutely essential. He broke decisively with Hegel by insisting on the primacy of the material world, of sensuous existence. He famously said nature is the ground of man. He argued that life and truth are only found where essence is united with actual material existence. He basically brought the discussion back down to earth, literally.
But Marx still criticized Feuerbach's materialism, didn't he? Called it contemplative. What was missing for Marx?
Yeah, for Marx, Feuerbach was ahistorical. He sort of replaced Hegel's abstract Geist with an equally abstract fixed man interacting with a fixed nature. Marx argued this lacked the dynamic historical element. You can't understand humanity separate from the constantly evolving process of natural history and social production. Marx insisted consciousness is merely conscious existence. It's linked to concrete social practices, to what people actually do.
And this leads straight back to that core idea of praxis. The goal of this new materialism isn't just to interpret the world, but to change it, revolutionizing practice.
Exactly. This is where ecological thinking and revolutionary politics really start to merge. If nature is the ground of human existence, then changing our social relationship to nature becomes a revolutionary act. This emphasis on practical, unified material knowledge led Marx to a pretty profound prediction about the future of how we'd think about things, about intellectual life.
He predicted the end of academic silos, basically, the unification of knowledge.
He did. He wrote that natural science will in time subsume the science of man, just as the science of man will subsume natural science. There will be one science. It's this vision of integrated, holistic, dialectical knowledge, where you can't study human society or history or economics without simultaneously studying chemistry, biology, physics. I mean, that's a foundational ecological statement right there.
Okay, so understanding Marx as a materialist really sets the stage for what he was arguing against in his own time. And that was this persistent, really powerful influence of philosophical and religious idealism. It was creeping into both natural science and political economy. Let's start with the natural sciences and what our sources call the reign of natural theology.
Yeah, the world Marx lived in, even among many scientists, was still heavily dominated by the traditional scale of nature or the great chain of being. This was a really rigid, static worldview. It assumed species were immutable, created separately by God. And surprise, surprise, humans were conveniently placed near the top. It perfectly supported the social hierarchy of the time.
And the philosophical linchpin for this hierarchy, the killer argument for divine design, was William Paley's watchmaker analogy.
Paley's Natural Theology from 1802. Yeah, hugely influential. It was actually a required reading for Charles Darwin when he was studying. Paley argued, look, if you find a watch in a field, its intricate design proves there was a designer, right? He then applied this logic to nature. The complexity of a human eye, the social structure of a beehive, the perfect way joints fit together, all of it proved divine intention. A designer.
And this wasn't just abstract theology, was it? It had a very clear social function.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Paley's philosophy essentially asserted that whatever is expedient is right. If nature was perfectly designed by God, then its current state, including all the social suffering, poverty, established hierarchies, it must be part of a benevolent, rational, divine plan. It effectively just rationalized the existing social and economic order. It justified exploitation as, well, just a necessary part of God's grand design.
So it makes sense then that the growth of materialism, with its ideas about deep time, infinite space, evolution, it was seen as a direct existential threat to this whole established order.
Absolutely, a massive threat. The materialist view challenged the biblical timeline, the whole idea of fixed, unchanging species, and therefore the entire system of social and religious privilege built on that. And this wasn't just, polite intellectual debate. It had severe consequences. We see it centuries earlier with the persecution of Giordano Bruno for his Epicurean cosmology. And in the early 19th century, people like William Lawrence were actually forced by authorities to withdraw lectures on human anatomy because his materialist view challenged the spiritual origin of man.
Okay, let's carry this theological framework over into economics now and talk about Malthus. The Parson naturalists were key figures here, integrating this static divine determinism right into economic theory.
Yeah, it's often forgotten, but many of these early population theorists who ended up shaping global policy, people like Alfred Russel Wallace, Joseph Townsend, and of course the big one, Thomas Malthus, they were Protestant clerics. They intentionally wove theology into their economic models. And the result was pretty much a doctrine of despair.
Malthus's famous theory, geometrical population growth versus arithmetical food growth. It was explicitly designed as a weapon against Enlightenment optimism, wasn't it?
Precisely. You had thinkers like William Godwin and Condorcet who believed that humanity, through reason and better social organization, could achieve endless progress, maybe even abolish poverty. Malthus's theory was specifically conceived to show this was impossible. He asserted that vice and misery, things like famine, disease, war were necessary, inescapable checks on population growth, actually ordained by providence, by God. He argued God ensured population increased faster than food. This caused, sure, partial evil, but ultimately ensured an overbalance of good by stimulating industry and moral restraint, primarily, of course, among the poor.
Right. And Marx and Engels just launched this ferocious critique against Malthusianism. Let's maybe detail their three main lines of attack, starting with the historical critique.
Okay, their first big attack was that Malthus's theory was fundamentally ahistorical. Malthus just assumed this same fixed natural principle applied universally, all times, all conditions, regardless of social organization or technology. Engels just mocked the absurdity of it. He pointed out that if Malthus's principle held true, then the Earth was already overpopulated when only one man existed, because population growth would immediately outstrip resources from day one. They argued, no, food scarcity is always a historical social problem. It's about distribution, access, how society is set up. It's not some fixed natural law.
Second, the critique was intensely class-based. I mean, this wasn't just dry theory. It had devastating real-world political consequences.
Absolutely. Malthusianism became the perfect ideological tool to justify viewing the poor as just, inevitable surplus. Malthus explicitly argued against poor relief. He said the poor, having drawn a blank in life's lottery, basically had no right to subsistence. This was the theoretical justification for the really punitive New Poor Law of 1834 in Britain. It abolished most outdoor relief, forced people into workhouses under absolutely brutal conditions. It effectively compelled workers to accept any level of exploitation offered by factory owners because the only alternative was institutional starvation.
Grim stuff. And their third major point was that Malthus's economic model was just based on flawed science.
Yeah, basically scientific fraud. Malthus had zero empirical evidence for his claim that food could only increase arithmetically. None. It was just a bald, authoritative assertion designed purely to back up his authoritative political position. Marx saw Malthusianism not as real science, but as the economic expression of the religious dogma about the necessary antagonism between spirit and nature, just dressed up in some pseudoscientific ratios.
Okay, so after tackling Malthusian fatalism, Marx then turned his critique towards a different kind of determinism, something our sources call mechanistic Prometheanism, particularly linked to Pierre-Joseph Proudhon.
Right, this is a really crucial distinction. Marx wasn't anti-technology, not at all, but he strongly criticized Proudhon's view of progress. Proudhon saw it as this sort of metaphysical, mechanistic glorification of the human conquest of nature. Proudhon saw technology and the division of labor as inevitably leading towards machinery as some kind of providential aim, a sort of technological teleology, but detached from the actual social relations of production, from who owned what, who was exploited.
So the problem wasn't the struggle with nature itself, which Marx recognized was, eternal and necessary,
Right.
but the alienation caused by specifically capitalist social relations within that struggle.
Exactly. Marx argued the real issue lies in the alienation of humanity from nature under specific exploitative systems. He observed how capitalism distorts natural necessity. For instance, he pointed out that under capitalism, rent, which should maybe reflect humanity's connection to the land, instead of binding man to nature, has merely bound the exploitation of the land to competition. Proudhon's mistake, for Marx, was focusing mystically on the conquest itself, without grounding the analysis in the material substance and the actual historical course of production.
Okay, this shift now, from philosophical critique to really concrete physical analysis, this is where Marx's ecology truly comes into focus. And this analysis hinges almost entirely on the scientific breakthroughs happening in soil chemistry in the mid-19th century, especially the work of Justus von Liebig.
Yeah, the mid-19th century saw a genuine crisis brewing, the crisis of soil exhaustion. European and North American agriculture, really intensified by industrial processes, was literally running out of nutrients. The Second Agricultural Revolution, roughly 1830 to 1880, depended heavily on this new chemical understanding. And what Liebig revealed was, frankly, terrifying for the time. Marx considered Liebig's findings foundational, more important, he said, than all the political economists put together.
Wow. Why did Marx rate Liebig so highly? What was the big insight?
Liebig, who's basically the founder of modern agricultural chemistry, proved that key nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, were being permanently withdrawn from the soil. Why? Because capitalist agriculture prevented their return. He demonstrated that land wasn't some infinitely resilient resource you could just exploit forever. No, it was a finite system based on nutrient cycling. This exposed the ultimate physical limit, the contradiction of the capitalist system, something abstract political economy just ignored or assumed away. The system was literally eating its own material foundation.
And the immediate global consequence of this nutrient crisis was something pretty dramatic: guano imperialism.
That's one of the most vivid examples of this metabolic rift in action.
Yeah.
The realization that soil needed fixed, external inputs led to this frantic global scramble for natural fertilizers. Guano, the accumulated droppings of seabirds rich in phosphates and nitrogen, became like gold. This demand drove this huge, often brutal trade. It led to the rapid exploitation of these fixed, finite natural resources on remote islands. The U.S. famously seized 94 islands in the mid-1800s under the 1856 Guano Islands Act, purely to secure these finite resources. The physical ecological crisis directly fueled an imperial crisis.
So let's define the key ecological concept Marx derived from all the scientific work: the metabolic rift. He borrowed the term from physiology, didn't he? Stoffwechsel.
Yeah, Stoffwechsel, or metabolic exchange. It's the material interchange between an organism or society and nature. Marx adapted it to describe the necessary, interdependent material interaction between human society and the natural environment. In a healthy system, this is a balanced cycle. Nutrients go out, nutrients come back.
But capitalism introduces an irreparable rift. How does that happen? What's the mechanism?
The rift arises because of that fundamental antagonistic division between town and country created by capitalism. The system concentrates workers and production in cities while extracting resources, food, fiber from the land. This concentration, this separation, violently disrupts the natural metabolic process.
And the most, maybe visceral example Marx and Engels focused on was the urban waste problem. This really makes the concept of the rift tangible, I think.
Absolutely. Think about 19th century London or Manchester. All the human and animal waste produced in these massive, crowded cities. Waste which contains the exact essential soil nutrients Liebig identified. It wasn't being recycled back to the farmland where the food came from. Instead, it was concentrated. It became sewage. It polluted the cities themselves, the rivers. Remember the great stink of the Thames, and it caused huge outbreaks of diseases like cholera. Engels wrote vividly about the universal pollution in Manchester. Marx stated very clearly that this failure to return waste to the soil violated the everlasting nature-imposed conditions of human existence. The urban population was basically consuming the fertility of the countryside and returning only pollution. It's a fundamentally broken system.
And Marx saw this rift not just locally between a city and its hinterland, but as a global colonial dynamic too.
Yes, the rift was globalized through trade and colonialism. Marx drew directly on Liebig's claims that colonizing nations, like Great Britain, systematically robbed all countries of the conditions of their fertility. The most stark example was Ireland. Even during the Great Famine, Ireland was exporting immense amounts of grain, cattle, and therefore soil nutrients to Britain. This left its own land chronically exhausted, unable to sustain its own population. The metabolic rift becomes an engine of imperialism.
Now, tracing this ecological crisis right back to its historical roots, Marx tied the metabolic rift to the very origin story of the capitalist system, primitive accumulation.
Yes, the ecological breakdown isn't some unfortunate side effect of capitalism. It's traceable right back to its necessary precondition. Primitive accumulation is that violent historical process, the one where the great mass of the population, mostly agricultural laborers, was forcibly separated from the soil, which Marx called their natural workshop.
The enclosures in England being the classic example of this violent separation.
Exactly. The enclosures, which people like Thomas More criticized even centuries earlier, destroyed communal property rights. They ended the traditional access the peasantry had to common land, to resources needed for survival. This violent act created a class of free, unprotected, and rightless proletarians, people who had nothing left to sell but their labor power to survive. This separation of the worker from the land is the sine qua non styled the absolute essential condition for the entire capitalist system. It simultaneously creates the propertyless worker needed for factories and sets the stage for the physical separation of town and country that drives the metabolic rift. The two are intrinsically linked from the start.
Okay, so this materialist foundation, it wasn't just philosophical. It was constantly being reinforced by scientific breakthroughs, not just in chemistry, but in biology, too. The mid-19th century was absolutely defined by Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. And Marx famously saw Darwin's work as providing the basis in natural history for our view.
Yeah, Marx was a huge admirer initially. Darwin's theory of natural selection dealt this decisive materialist blow to teleology, to that metaphysical rigidity of the concept of species, which had been such a pillar of natural theology. It provided a material explanation for the dynamic history of life. It showed species weren't fixed divine creations, but evolved through natural processes.
But Marx's admiration wasn't completely unqualified, was it? He specifically criticized Darwin for basically importing Malthusian ideas and applying them wholesale to the natural world.
That's the crucial caveat, exactly. Marx critiqued Darwin for adopting Malthus's concept of the struggle for existence. He argued Darwin was essentially projecting contemporary English competitive society, its division of labor, competition, onto the animal and plant kingdoms. He famously described this borrowing as simply taking Hobbes's bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all, and applying it straight to the natural world. A bit of a simplistic projection.
What's really fascinating, though, is that Marx and Engels insisted on a more dialectical view of nature, seeing it as encompassing both conflict and cooperation.
Yes, they insisted nature involves both strife, which Darwin highlighted, and harmony, particularly the cooperative and interdependent metabolic exchange processes that Liebig had revealed. A rational human society, therefore, has to recognize both aspects. To focus solely on competition, as the Malthusian lens encouraged, is to ignore the necessary interdependence, the mutual sustenance required for all life, which is precisely what the metabolic rift was destroying.
Okay, shifting to human development now. Marx integrated this natural history by defining human evolution through labor, making this distinction between natural technology and human technology.
Right, this helps root humanity firmly back in the material world as part of nature, but also distinct. Natural technology, as Darwin studied it, is the formation of organs in plants and animals that serve as instruments for production. A beaver's teeth, a bird's wings. Human technology, conversely, is the social production of tools outside the body, a hammer, a plow, machinery. And Marx posed this critical question: shouldn't the history of these productive organs of man in society, the material basis of every social organization, deserve just as much attention as the natural ones.
And Engels really ran with this, didn't he? Developing a co-evolutionary hypothesis that put the development of the hand, and therefore labor, as the key driver of human evolution.
Yeah, Engels argued that human labor, especially tool making, and the selective pressures that came with it for specialized hand use, drove the evolution of our species. This led subsequently to the enlargement of the brain and the development of speech. This directly countered the long-held idealist view, which always prioritized the brain, the mind, as the sole starting point for human evolution. Engels' hypothesis, which he developed long before discoveries like Australopithecus, was this amazing materialist anticipation of modern anthropology, the idea that it was our ability to alter the environment through labor, not just think about it, that really made us human.
Marx also extended this materialist view way back into prehistory, drawing heavily on the ethnology of Lewis Henry Morgan.
Morgan's work, Ancient Society, was pivotal for them. It rooted human social development, the progression of government, family structures, property relations, firmly in the growth of the arts of subsistence. This meant things like the invention of tools, fire use, agricultural techniques. By grounding tree history in material necessity, Marx and Engels could confirm their materialist conception of history stretched back way before capitalism. They saw the human struggle with nature as this constant factor, but one that's always mediated by specific forms of social organization.
All right, finally, let's bring this all back to practical application. If the core problem is this antagonistic metabolic rift created by capitalism, what was the goal? What would a rational, non-capitalist system aim for in relation to nature?
The goal was spelled out in specific measures, outlined in things like the Communist Manifesto and later works. Their political program explicitly included the abolition of private property and land, the improvement of the soil in accordance with a common plan, and crucially, the more even dispersal of the population across the landscape, gradual abolition of the town-country distinction. This was a direct, structural counterproposal to Malthus, who basically wanted to sweep peasants into the cities to become factory fodder.
So the objective wasn't some utopian dream of eliminating the interaction with nature, but the rational regulation of the human nature metabolism.
Exactly. The struggle with nature, the need to interact with it for survival, that's necessary. It's part of existence. The goal is the rational regulation of that metabolic interaction, ensuring it's carried out in conditions most worthy and appropriate for their human nature. This means eliminating the waste, the alienation, the irreparable rift created by the profit motive and private property, and replacing it with a sustainable, socially planned interaction based on shared scientific understanding of nature's actual limits and cycles. Hashtag outro.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really fundamentally reshaped, I think, our understanding of Marx. We've traced his systematic critique of capitalism through this lineage of materialist philosophy, the battles against natural theology and Malthusian fatalism, and critically, his profound engagement with soil chemistry and evolutionary biology.
Yeah, we've seen that his ecology is this complex dialectical naturalism. It's neither simple nature worship nor just crude conquest of nature thinking. It's a commitment to restoring the metabolic balance that private property and profit-driven alienation had so violently distorted. His systematic engagement with physical science really demonstrates that ecological concerns weren't just incidental. They were absolutely central to his entire political economy.
And it's a necessary, maybe tragic, historical point to make that this whole tradition of ecological materialism was often violently suppressed within state socialist regimes later on. The purges of scientifically focused ecologists in the Soviet Union, people like Nikolai Bukharin, Nikolai Vavilov, it tragically mirrored the very failures of ecological short-sightedness that Marx's work was actually trying to overcome.
It really proves that political structure is inseparable from material processes, doesn't it? Marx insisted land isn't just a free gift of nature. It requires embodied time, labor, conscious effort to maintain its fertility. His analysis remains, well, startlingly relevant today as we face global soil degradation, climate crisis, all these interconnected issues.
So what does this all mean for us, for you listening, as we navigate our own hyper-urbanized industrial consumer reality?
Well, here's something for you to mull over. If Marx identified the greatest ecological failure of capitalism as this irreparable rift in the soil's metabolism, driven by the antagonistic separation of town and country, meaning the failure to return essential nutrients from human waste back to the land, then what fundamental structural changes must our current cities and our industrial food systems adopt to rationally, organically, and sustainably restore that metabolic connection? That link between the urban population and the land that feeds it. Is it just about better technology, better sewage treatment? Or does it require rethinking the entire physical structure, the very geography of modern urban existence?
A huge question, one that connects philosophy, history, economics, and the very ground beneath our feet. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.